Picture yourself in a cold, damp dungeon, your neck bound by a cruel device. Sharp prongs press under your chin and against your chest, biting into your skin if you dare to nod off. Sleep is impossible. Mercy is a distant dream. This was the grim reality for those branded heretics. Tormented by a tool as simple as it was sinister, the heretic's fork. Chapter 1. Unveiling the device. Let's pull back the curtain on the heretic's fork, a tool that embodies the brutal ingenuity of medieval torture. This wasn't some elaborate machine, it was a deceptively simple piece of metalwork, about 4 to 6 inches long, crafted into a double-ended fork with 2 sharp prongs at each end, resembling a tuning fork forged in a nightmare. A leather strap or iron collar secured it around the victim's neck, positioning one set of prongs beneath the chin and the other against the sternum. The design was diabolically precise. Any attempt to lower the head, whether to rest, sleep, or even shift position, drove the points into flesh, causing sharp, searing pain. Blood would trickle from puncture wounds, and the constant strain of holding the head upright led to muscle cramps and exhaustion. The fork wasn't meant to kill outright, but to inflict relentless suffering, stripping away the victim's ability to find even a moment's peace. Its primary goal, to break the spirit through sleep deprivation, forcing confessions from those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or defying the Church's authority. Originating in the late 15th century, the heretic's fork became a grim staple of the Spanish Inquisition, a campaign led by figures like Tomás de Torquemada to root out religious dissent. Historical accounts, like those from the 1480s in Seville, describe victims strapped with the fork in dank cells, standing or seated on stone benches, unable to lie down. For example, a merchant named Diego de Souza, accused of secretly practicing Judaism in 1481, reportedly endured the fork for 2 days before confessing under duress. The device's simplicity made it terrifyingly practical. Blacksmiths could forge it from basic iron, costing little and requiring no maintenance, which allowed its use to spread across European tribunals. Its psychological toll was as devastating as the physical pain. Sleep deprivation caused hallucinations, which inquisitors interpreted as signs of demonic influence, further justifying their accusations. Victims like Ana de Mendoza, a noblewoman accused of heresy in 1492, described visions of shadows after 3 sleepless nights, which were used against her in trial. Practically, the fork was often tightened to ensure constant pressure, with some versions featuring adjustable screws to intensify the prong's bite. Wounds from the prongs, if untreated in filthy dungeon conditions, could lead to infections like sepsis, which sometimes proved fatal. Yet, the Church valued the fork for its non-lethal nature. It kept victims alive for public recantations or executions, like the infamous auto de fe ceremonies, where heretics were paraded before burning. The heretic's fork wasn't just a tool, it was a calculated weapon of control, blending physical torment with mental collapse to enforce obedience. As we move forward, we'll explore the fiery religious fervor that gave birth to this device, diving into the world that made such cruelty not just possible, but necessary. Chapter 2. Roots in Religious Cruelty. Step into the fiery heart of the era that birthed this cruel device, the world of the medieval Church and its relentless grip on power. The heretic's fork emerged during a time when religious conformity was non-negotiable, particularly during the late 15th and early 16th centuries in Europe. The Catholic Church, facing threats from reformers, pagans, and those questioning its doctrines, turned to extreme measures to maintain control. The Spanish Inquisition, launched in 1478 by Ferdinand II and Isabella I, was a key driver, aiming to purify Spain of heretics, Jews, and Muslims who might undermine Christian unity. The fork wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of the Church's fear of dissent. Inquisitors believed that keeping a victim awake with this device would expose their true thoughts. Delirium was seen as a window to the soul's guilt. Historical records show cases like that of Maria de Bohemia, a woman accused of witchcraft in 1499, who endured the fork for 3 days before confessing under pressure. The device's use spread beyond Spain to places like Germany and Italy, where local tribunals adapted it for their own witch hunts. Practically, the fork was often paired with other tortures, like the rack, to maximize suffering without immediate death, ensuring the victim could still face trial or public execution. Its psychological impact was profound. Victims, unable to rest, often broke down, confessing to anything to escape the torment. This chapter reveals the religious fervor that fueled the fork's creation, setting the stage for how it fit into the broader machinery of the Inquisition's terror. Chapter 3. A tool of the tribunals. Let's step into the shadowy halls of the tribunals, where the heretic's fork found its true purpose as a weapon of fear and control. By the early 16th century, the device had become a grim fixture in the judicial processes of the Inquisition, particularly in Spain, but also in regions like France and the Holy Roman Empire. These tribunals weren't just courts, they were theaters of dread, designed to stamp out dissent and showcase the Church's unyielding power. The fork was a perfect fit for this mission, used during interrogations to weaken prisoners before they even faced their accusers. Inquisitors, like those in Toledo's tribunals, would strap the fork onto a victim, say, a scholar accused of reading banned texts like Erasmus' works in 1520, and leave them in a cell for days. The constant pain and inability to sleep turned even the strongest wills to desperation, making them more likely to confess to crimes they may not have committed. Historical records note cases like Juan de Vergara, a humanist scholar in 1530, who, after enduring the fork, admitted to vague charges of heretical sympathies, despite little evidence. The device's use wasn't limited to high-profile cases. It targeted anyone from peasants to nobles, especially women accused of witchcraft, whose supposed visions under sleep deprivation were twisted into proof of guilt. The fork's role in these settings wasn't just to punish, but to intimidate entire communities. Public knowledge of its use deterred others from straying. This chapter uncovers the tribunal's reliance on the fork to enforce fear, paving the way for how it shaped the lives of those caught in its grip. Chapter 4. The victim's plight. Now, let's turn our focus to the people who endured the heretic's fork, the men and women whose lives were shattered by its unrelenting cruelty. Picture a dimly lit cell in 16th century Salamanca, where someone like Catalina de Zamora, a seamstress accused of witchcraft in 1527, sat trembling with the fork strapped to her neck. The device didn't discriminate. It targeted anyone labeled a threat to the Church's authority, be they scholars, midwives, converted Jews, or even devout Christians who spoke out of turn. The fork's design ensured constant torment. The victim had to keep their head perfectly upright, muscles straining, as any tilt drove the prongs deeper into their skin. Sleep was impossible, and over days, exhaustion blurred into delirium. Historical accounts describe victims like Pedro de Aranda, a merchant in 1501, who, after 4 days with the fork, began muttering incoherently about visions of saints, which inquisitors seized as evidence of heresy. Women, especially those accused of witchcraft, faced the fork disproportionately. Their confessions, wrung out through sleepless agony, often implicated others, creating a vicious cycle of accusations. For instance, in a 1532 case in Aragon, a healer named Isabel La Nagra endured the fork for 3 days, her resulting confession naming 6 others as witches, all later tortured. The physical toll was brutal puncture wounds often festered in unsanitary cells, leading to infections that could turn deadly. Beyond the body, the psychological scars were profound. Survivors, if they were released, carried the trauma of endless wakefulness and betrayal of their own words. The fork didn't just punish individuals, it broke families and communities, as fear of accusation silenced dissent. This chapter shines a light on the human cost of the fork's cruelty, setting the stage for how it became a tool of mass intimidation in the next part of our story. Chapter 5. A symbol of mass intimidation. Let's shift our gaze to the broader impact of the heretic's fork, where it transcended the dungeon to become a chilling emblem of fear across entire communities. By the mid-16th century, the fork's reputation had spread far beyond the cells of the Inquisition, seeping into the public consciousness of towns and villages across Europe. In places like Seville or Augsburg, whispers of the device's torment were enough to silence potential dissenters before they even spoke. The Church and its tribunals didn't need to use the fork on everyone. Its mere existence, coupled with public displays of punishment, ensured compliance. For example, during the 1540s in Castile, inquisitors would parade victims through the streets before or after their ordeal, sometimes still wearing the fork, to show crowds what awaited those who strayed. A documented case from 1545 in Barcelona describes a blacksmith named Guillaume de Prat, accused of Lutheran sympathies, whose public appearance with the fork led to a sharp drop in local reformist gatherings. The device's psychological warfare extended to how it was described in sermons. Priests warned congregations that heretics faced sleepless nights of agony, painting the fork as divine justice for sin. This wasn't just about punishing the accused. It was about controlling the masses, making neighbors spy on neighbors out of fear of being next. In rural areas where tribunals were less common, traveling inquisitors carried the fork as a portable threat, its presence alone prompting confessions without use. The fork's legend grew, turning it into a tool that didn't always need to pierce flesh to enforce obedience. This chapter reveals how the fork's shadow loomed over society, leading us to explore how its use evolved as the Inquisition's grip tightened. Chapter 6. Evolution of the forks. Let's immerse ourselves in the chilling evolution of the heretic's fork, as it morphed from a simple interrogation tool into a multifaceted instrument of prolonged suffering, public spectacle, and psychological control across Europe in the 16th century. Initially crafted as a straightforward device for extracting confessions during the early days of the Spanish Inquisition, the fork's role expanded dramatically by the 1550s, reflecting the growing sophistication and paranoia of religious and secular authorities. No longer just a means to force quick admissions, the fork was adapted to serve broader purposes: prolonged punishment, public humiliation, and even as a deterrent in the escalating battle against heresy and witchcraft. Its transformation was driven by the Inquisition's need to maintain fear in an era when dissent, particularly from Protestant reformers and suspected witches, threatened the Church's authority. The fork's grim adaptability made it a perfect fit for this intensifying climate of control. as it was refined in both design and application to maximize its terror. The original Heretic's fork, used in the late 15th century, was a basic metal piece about 4 to 6 inches long, with 2 sharp prongs at each end, secured by a leather strap or iron collar. By the mid-16th century, however, inquisitors and torturers began experimenting with variations to heighten its cruelty. In cities like Valladolid, Spain, and Milan, Italy, records from the 1550s describe forks with longer, sharper prongs, sometimes up to an inch in length, designed to penetrate deeper into the skin and cause more intense pain. Some versions featured adjustable screws or ratchet mechanisms on the collar, allowing torturers to tighten the device incrementally, ensuring constant pressure against the victim's chin and sternum. A 1557 case in Venice provides a vivid example. Matteo de Bassium, a printer accused of distributing Protestant pamphlets, was fitted with a reinforced fork equipped with such screws. Trial documents note that the device was tightened daily over 10 days, leaving his neck and chest scarred and infected, his forced confession used to justify his imprisonment. This modification wasn't just about physical torment. It prolonged the ordeal, keeping victims in a state of sleepless agony for weeks rather than days, breaking their resolve through sheer endurance. Regional variations of the fork emerged as its use spread beyond Spain. In the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in Germany, torturers crafted forks with broader, flatter prongs to inflict wider surface trauma, aiming to leave visible scars that marked the accused as heretics even after release. A 1563 record from Augsburg describes a tailor named Hans Weber, accused of Lutheran sympathies, whose fork left permanent marks on his sternum, serving as a public warning to others. In France, some forks were fitted with serrated prongs, increasing the risk of tearing flesh with even the slightest movement. These design changes reflected local preferences for punishment and the growing competition among tribunals to demonstrate their zeal in combating heresy. The fork's portability, lightweight and easy to produce, made it ideal for traveling inquisitors, who carried it to remote regions where larger torture devices, like the rack, were impractical. In a 1560 case in rural Portugal, a traveling inquisitor used a fork on a shepherd named João Mendes, accused of blasphemy in a makeshift cell, demonstrating how the device's simplicity allowed it to reach even isolated communities. The fork's role in public spectacle also grew during this period. While it was initially used in private interrogations by the 1560s, it became a tool for public punishment, especially during the elaborate auto da fe ceremonies of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. These were grand public events where heretics were paraded, often to their execution, to reinforce the Church's power. In Iwu Lil A, Auto da Fe in Lisbon, historical accounts describe 3 women, accused of secretly practicing Judaism, being marched through the streets with forks strapped to their necks. The prongs, deliberately positioned to draw blood as they walked, amplified their suffering and humiliated them before jeering crowds. The sight of their pained, upright postures, heads forced back to avoid deeper wounds, was meant to deter onlookers from straying from orthodoxy. A chronicler of the event noted that the crowd fell silent, awed and terrified as the women passed, the fork's stark cruelty leaving an indelible impression. This public use turned the fork into a symbol of divine justice, its visibility ensuring that entire communities felt the weight of the Inquisition's authority. The fork's evolution also saw it integrated into secular courts, particularly in the burgeoning witch trials that swept northern Europe. In Scotland and France, where witch hunts gained momentum in the 1560s, the fork was repurposed to test a suspect's supernatural ties. Authorities believed that sleep deprivation could reveal a witch's pact with the devil, as exhaustion-induced hallucinations were interpreted as confessions of guilt. A 1568 trial in Toulouse, France, documents a woman named Marie Dubois, accused of cursing crops, who was fitted with a fork for 6 days. Her delirious ramblings about flying with demons were recorded as evidence, leading to her execution and the arrest of 4 others she named. The fork's psychological impact was key. By preventing sleep, it pushed victims into a state of mental collapse, where they might say anything to end their suffering. This made it a favored tool in regions where witch hunters sought rapid confessions to fuel mass trials, as seen in the Trier witch trials of the 1580s, where forks were used alongside other tortures to break dozens of suspects. The fork's evolution wasn't just physical, it reflected a deeper shift in the psychology of control. Inquisitors and magistrates learned that the fork's true power lay not in killing but in prolonging suffering, making it a tool of attrition. Unlike the rack or burning, which could end in death, the fork kept victims alive, their torment a living warning to others. This calculated cruelty was evident in a 1570 case in Seville, where a converso converted Jew named Diego Lopez was subjected to the fork for 2 weeks during his trial for relapse into Judaism. Court records describe how his screams echoed through the tribunal, deliberately left audible to unnerve other prisoners. The fork's ability to combine physical pain with psychological despair through sleeplessness and the constant threat of self-inflicted wounds made it uniquely suited to an era obsessed with rooting out hidden enemies. As we move forward, this chapter's exploration of the fork's chilling adaptability sets the stage for its pivotal role in the witch hunts, where its terror reached new heights in a world gripped by fear of the supernatural. Chapter 7. The fork in the witch hunts. Let's plunge into the chaotic, fear-drenched world of the European witch hunts, where the heretic's fork carved out a particularly sinister role in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. As paranoia about witchcraft swept across Europe from the windswept moors of Scotland to the dense forests of Bavaria, the fork became a favored tool for those determined to purge society of supposed devil worshippers. Unlike its earlier use in the Spanish Inquisition, where it targeted heretics and religious dissenters, the fork now found a new purpose in the hands of both ecclesiastical and secular authorities obsessed with rooting out witchcraft. The device's ability to enforce sleeplessness was seen as a divine test. Magistrates and witch hunters believed that those in league with Satan could withstand prolonged wakefulness, their supernatural pacts granting them unnatural resilience. This twisted logic made the fork a perfect instrument for breaking suspects, especially women, who comprised roughly 80% of the accused. According to historical estimates from regions like Germany and France, the fork's simplicity and portability made it ideal for the makeshift trials that sprang up in villages and towns, often held in barns, town halls, or cramped local jails converted into interrogation chambers. Consider the case of Agnes Sampson, a midwife caught up in Scotland's North Berwick witch trials of 1590. Historical records describe how Agnes, accused of leading a coven, was fitted with a heretic's fork during her imprisonment in Edinburgh. For 4 days, she was forced to stand in a cramped cell, the prongs digging into her chin and sternum, preventing even a moment's rest. Her eventual confession, describing a fantastical meeting with the devil on a stormy shore, was likely induced by the delirium of sleep deprivation, a state that inquisitors interpreted as proof of her guilt. Her words, recorded in trial documents, sparked a wave of arrests, as she named other supposed witches under duress, illustrating how the fork fueled a vicious cycle of accusations. Similarly, in the German town of Würzburg in Iwu-Jiaoyi, a healer named Ursula Gites endured the fork for 5 agonizing days. Court records note her incoherent mutterings about flying on broomsticks, which were presented as evidence of her demonic pact, leading to her execution and the torture of 7 others she implicated. These cases highlight the fork's dual role. It wasn't just a tool of physical torment, but a weapon of psychological destruction, turning victims' own minds against them. The fork's use in witch hunts wasn't limited to interrogation rooms. In some regions, like southern France, it was displayed publicly to amplify fear. During the 1610 trials in Aix province, authorities placed a heretic's fork on a table in the town square, its prongs gleaming as a warning to onlookers while accused witches were questioned nearby. This public spectacle, documented in local chronicles, pressured neighbors to inform on one another, as the mere sight of the device suggested the agony awaiting the accused. The fork was often paired with other tortures, such as thumbscrews or the strapido, to escalate suffering. In a 1609 case in Bamberg, Germany, a woman named Katharina Hennet, accused of sorcery, was subjected to both the fork and water torture, her confessions under sleeplessness and pain leading to the deaths of dozens in a regional witch panic. The fork's effectiveness lay in its ability to exploit sleep, deprivation's devastating effects. Modern science confirms that after 72 hours without sleep, people experience hallucinations and cognitive collapse, a fact intuited by witches who saw such symptoms as proof of devilry. The fork's role in these hunts also reflected the era's gendered biases. Women, often midwives, healers, or widows, were disproportionately targeted, their social vulnerability making them easy scapegoats. In a 1597 trial in Trier, Germany, a widow named Margarete Schmidt was fitted with the fork after neighbors accused her of cursing crops. Her 3-day ordeal, detailed in trial records, ended in a confession that implicated her daughter, perpetuating a tragic chain of betrayal. The fork's psychological impact was profound. Victims, driven to exhaustion, often confessed to fantastical crimes, witches' sabbaths, shape-shifting, or pacts with demons that fed the hysteria. These confessions, extracted in places like Salem, Massachusetts, during its 1692 witch trials, where the fork was occasionally referenced in New England records, justified further hunts, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear. The fork's use in these settings wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about controlling communities, turning suspicion into a weapon as powerful as the device itself. This chapter lays bare the fork's chilling role in the witch hunt's terror, setting the stage for how its use began to fade as reason challenged superstition. Chapter 8. The fork's fading shadowlets step into the twilight of the heretic's fork's grim reign. As the Inquisition's iron grip began to loosen and the device's use dwindled in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, as Europe moved toward the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and skepticism of unchecked religious authority, the fork's role in tribunals and witch hunts started to wane. By the 1670s, the Spanish Inquisition, once the fork's primary stage, was losing influence due to political shifts and growing criticism from intellectuals like Benedict de Spinoza, who condemned such tortures as barbaric. Yet, the fork didn't vanish overnight. In remote regions, like rural Poland or parts of the Holy Roman Empire. It lingered in local courts well into the 1690s, used sporadically against those accused of blasphemy or sorcery. A poignant example comes from a 1689 trial in Bamberg, Germany, where a farmer named Hans Müller, accused of cursing livestock, endured the fork for 3 days before his case was dismissed due to lack of evidence, a rare outcome reflecting changing attitudes. The fork's decline was also tied to practical shifts. Newer interrogation methods, like psychological coercion or less overtly cruel devices, began to replace it, as authorities sought cleaner ways to extract confessions without the public backlash that gruesome tortures provoked. In Spain, records from the 1700s show the fork being phased out in favor of verbal intimidation or confinement, though some inquisitors clung to it for its feared reputation. The device's legacy, however, persisted in cultural memory and pamphlets from the era, like those circulated in Amsterdam in 1690, depicted the fork to expose the Church's cruelty, fueling anti-Inquisition sentiment. By the early 18th century, as secular courts gained prominence and witch hunts subsided, the fork was largely relegated to history, its physical remnants preserved in archives or private collections as relics of a darker age. This chapter traces the slow fade of the fork's terror, setting the stage for how its story survived in modern times through tales and artifacts. Chapter 9. The Fork's Legacy in Tales and Artifacts. Let's journey into the afterlife of the heretic's fork, where its chilling presence lingered not in dungeons but in the stories, art, and relics that kept its memory alive. By the early 18th century, as the Enlightenment reshaped Europe's intellectual landscape, the fork transitioned from a tool of torture to a symbol of a bygone era's cruelty. Preserved in cultural narratives and physical remnants, the device's fearsome reputation was no longer spread through its use, but through pamphlets, books, and illustrations that exposed the horrors of the Inquisition. In 1720s London, for instance, printers like John Dunton published broadsheets featuring woodcuts of the fork, showing victims with prongs piercing their flesh, accompanied by sensationalized accounts of its use. These images, often exaggerated for effect, captivated readers and fueled growing public outrage against religious persecution. One such pamphlet, circulated in 1724, described a fictionalized account of a young woman named Clara of Toledo, whose supposed endurance of the fork for 7 days became a rallying cry for reformers advocating for humane treatment of prisoners. Beyond print, the fork's story was woven into oral traditions. In rural Spain, villagers shared cautionary tales about El Tenedor del Haraj, warning children of the Church's wrath, even as the Inquisition's power faded. These stories often blended fact with myth. One tale from Aragon spoke of a spectral inquisitor who haunted a village, his fork glowing in the moonlight, a fiction that kept the device's terror alive. Meanwhile, actual forks became coveted artifacts. By the mid-18th century, wealthy collectors and early museums, like the Ashmolean in Oxford, began acquiring them as curiosities of a barbaric past. A surviving fork from a 1710 Seville auction, now housed in a Madrid museum, bears engravings of crosses, hinting at its religious origins. Though its worn leather strap tells a silent story of countless victims, the fork also inspired literary works that cemented its place in cultural memory. In 1787, the German writer Christian August Vulpius published a novel, Rinaldo Rinaldini, which included a scene of a prisoner enduring the fork, amplifying its infamy among Romantic-era readers. fascinated by Gothic horror. Similarly, in France, early 19th century plays staged in Paris theaters dramatized Inquisition tortures, with actors wearing prop forks to evoke gasps from audiences. These depictions weren't always accurate. Some showed forks as massive theatrical contraptions, but they ensured the device remained a potent symbol of oppression. Even in the New World, where the Inquisition had a lighter footprint, travelers' accounts, like those of a 1760s Jesuit missionary in Mexico, referenced the fork as a relic of Old World cruelty, shaping perceptions of European history. The fork's physical remnants, though rare, were meticulously studied by 19th century historians like Henry Charles Lee, whose 1906 work on the Spanish Inquisition detailed its mechanics based on surviving examples. These artifacts, often rusted and pitted from age, were displayed in exhibitions to educate and horrify, reinforcing the narrative of progress away from such cruelties. Yet, the fork's legacy wasn't just academic, it carried a moral weight, reminding societies of the dangers of unchecked power. In some ways, its story mirrored that of other torture devices, like the rack, but its unique focus on sleep deprivation gave it a peculiar horror that resonated in an era increasingly aware of psychological trauma. This chapter captures how the heretic's fork lived on, not in use but in the collective imagination, paving the way for our final exploration of its modern echoes and what it teaches us today. Chapter 10: Modern Echoes and Lessons of the Forces. We close our journey through the grim history of the heretic's fork. Let's reflect on how its shadow stretches into the modern world, not as a physical tool, but as a haunting reminder of human cruelty and the value of compassion. Today, the fork exists primarily in museum displays, historical texts, and popular media, yet its legacy speaks to timeless questions about power, justice, and the ethics of punishment. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the fork has been reimagined in films, books, and even video games, often as a symbol of medieval barbarity. For instance, in the 2008 film The Pit and the Pendulum, a loose adaptation of Poe's work, the fork appears briefly as a prop to evoke the terror of the Inquisition, its sharp prongs glinting in torchlight to unsettle audiences. Similarly, in video games like Assassin's Creed, Brotherhood 2010, references to the fork in historical codexes add authenticity to depictions of 16th century oppression, reminding players of the era's brutality. These portrayals, while sometimes sensationalized, keep the fork's story alive, ensuring that its horrors aren't forgotten in an age far removed from dungeons. Beyond entertainment, the fork has found a place in academic discourse, particularly in studies of torture and human rights. Historians like Elaine Scarry, in her 1985 book The Body in Pain, cite devices like the fork to explore how physical suffering was used to control thought, drawing parallels to modern psychological interrogation techniques. The fork's emphasis on sleep deprivation, for example, resonates chillingly with 20th century accounts of torture in places like Guantanamo Bay, where sleep disruption was documented as a method to break detainees, as reported in declassified 2004 CIA memos. While the tools have changed, the principle using sleeplessness to erode resistance oses the fork's cruel logic, prompting scholars to question how far we've truly progressed. Museums, too, play a role in this reflection. The Torture Museum in Amsterdam, for instance, displays a 17th century heretic's fork alongside plaques explaining its psychological toll. inviting visitors to consider the moral implications of such devices in light of contemporary debates on human rights. The fork also sparks discussions in psychology about the effects of sleep deprivation. Modern studies, like those published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2015, confirm what inquisitors intuitively exploited. Prolonged sleeplessness causes cognitive breakdown, hallucinations, and emotional fragility, making the fork's historical use a grim precursor to scientific understanding. This connection has led activists to cite the fork in campaigns against modern torture, using its stark simplicity to argue that even low-tech methods can inflict profound harm. In 2019, a UN report on torture referenced historical devices, like the fork, to highlight the continuity of inhumane practices, urging global reforms in prisoner treatment. The fork's story thus serves as a cautionary tale, warning against the dehumanization that unchecked authority can justify in popular culture. The fork occasionally surfaces in unexpected ways. Heavy metal bands, like the Swedish group have used its imagery in album art, tapping into its dark allure to evoke rebellion against dogma. Online forums, like Reddit's Our History in 2023, see users debating the fork's cruelty compared to other torture devices, with some marveling at its efficiency and others horrified by its psychological sadism. These discussions show how the fork remains a point of fascination, a relic that bridges medieval fears with modern curiosities. Its physical remnants, fewer than a dozen verified forks, survive in collections like the British Museum, continue to draw crowds, their rusted prongs a silent testament to a time when faith justified brutality. What does the Heretic's fork teach us today? It's a stark reminder that cruelty often hides behind noble intentions, whether religious zeal or national security. Its history challenges us to question systems that prioritize control over empathy, urging vigilance against abuses of power. As we leave this dark chapter of history, let's carry forward its lessons. Compassion and justice must guide us, lest we repeat the mistakes of the past. If this journey through the fork's grim tale has gripped you, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below about what struck you most. Let's keep the conversation going as we explore history's shadows together.